Hello and welcome to the first of the London Embroidery School's online classes. Today we are going to be working on Valentino Roses, which look a little bit like this. I know, gorgeous, right? I bet you can already think of all the things that you would want to do with your Valentino rose. There are loads of applications for them, and I think they're really versatile. So, the things you're going to need to make your Valentino rose, you're going to need some fabric, unsurprisingly. So we would suggest something nice and lightweight. When we teach the class in the studio, we do it with a polyester organza, and that's definitely the easiest thing to start with. Today, I'm going to be working with a silk chiffon because this is what I've got to hand. Yes, work with what you've got, but if you've got something like a polyester organza or an organza of any kind, that would be the easiest thing to get started with. Failing that, tulle is also great to work with, or a chiffon. Chiffon's going to be a little bit more slippy, but you know, we'll make it work. You're going to need some base fabric as well, something that is quite sturdy and woven. A medium to heavy weight would be great. If you've got some felt to hand, that's also excellent as a base because it won't fray. But don't worry too much about the base because we're going to cut away as much as possible at the end anyways. You're going to need some thread as well that matches the colour of your lightweight fabric ideally, so something like this pairing is great, and a needle to go with. I've got a Sharps number 9 there, but a standard sewing needle that you're comfortable threading up will work just fine for this. You're going to need some scissors for fabric. You're also going to need some scissors for paper. It's up to you whether you want to use the same pair of scissors for that. I personally don't, but that is your choice. You will need some paper, a pencil and a ruler for the drafting of your petal guide. And you're going to need a couple of pins to hand as well, which will just help us along. If you've got an embroidery hoop to work with, that will be enormously helpful. If you don't have one, don't worry, we can work around that. If you're working on something sturdy like a felt, you probably don't need a hoop. But if you've got one, great, it'll make your life a bit easier. Also, if you've got something like a laying tool, this is definitely optional, but it might help with tucking in some of the loose ends towards the end of making your rose. But again, if you don't have one, not a disaster, but it can be helpful if you've got one. Right, let's get started with the drafting. So, drafting your Valentino Roses petal guide. You're going to need your paper, your ruler and your pencil. What you need to draw first off is 2 parallel lines which are 4.5 centimeters away from each other and are each 6 centimeters long. Once you've got those two that look like train tracks, then you just need to add a smooth curve that goes from one to the other. You can do this just by eye. It doesn't need to be too perfect. It just needs to be a smooth curve up the top, and then do the same down the bottom until you're left with something like this one here. And then when you're ready and you've got your paper scissors, cut that out so you're left with a guide that looks a little bit like this one. I know, doesn't look like much, does it? We're going to do great things with this. Next, I want to talk to you about fabrics. First of all, for your base fabric, as I mentioned, we're going to be cutting away most of the base fabric, so don't worry too much about that. If you have got an embroidery hoop and you've got something that's sort of similar coloured, obviously these aren't a perfect match, the two reds, but you know, they're going to work just fine for us today. If you've got a hoop, then great, hoop up your fabric in the normal way, and you can just pop that to one side to use later. If you want more details on the best ways to hoop up your fabric, we have a pro tips blog just on that, so do have a little look at that on our website for more guide tips on that sort of thing, you know, getting these basics right. If you haven't got a hoop to work with, but perhaps have some felt to hand instead, or a slightly heavier weight fabric, that would be preferable if you're not going to use a hoop, just because it's a little bit more sturdy and it will make your life a little bit easier to sew with if you haven't got a hoop to work with. So there are lots of options with this. Either way, if you are hooping up, you need to make sure that your piece of fabric is just big enough to hoop up nicely, basically. And if you're going for the felt option, I'd say make sure that it's about 10 by 10 minimum to work with. But we're going to cut most of it away at the end anyway. Your lightweight top fabric, you need to have a long, thin piece of fabric measuring 50 centimeters wide by 15 centimeters high. All of these measurements are going to be in the details alongside the video and blog, so don't worry about trying to remember them off the video. They will be written down for you elsewhere. Making your petals. So if you take your lightweight fabric, take a few minutes to prepare your fabric. You know, do give it an iron, make sure it's nice and flat, there's no obvious creases, or you know, if there's any pulls in it, obviously avoid those. Take a few minutes to make sure that your fabric is the best it can be for best results of your final embroidery. An awful lot of embroidery is about the preparation, even though it's not the most exciting part of embroidery. So do take your time with making the prep right and getting the best out of your make. Once you've got your fabric prepped, what you want to do is to lay it out, and we're going to start folding it from the bottom up. It doesn't really matter if you fold it in a concertina fashion or over and over itself into a roll. Either way is fine. So if you roll from the bottom, fold from the bottom like so, you want your fold to be a little bit wider than your petal guide, because this is what we're going to be cutting from. So fold it like so. Be decisive with your folds. You don't want to over handle your fabric, because the more you handle it, the more frayed it can become, particularly if you're working on something a little bit more awkward like I am today with this chiffon. So do be decisive with your folds and keep going. You're going to need a minimum of 8 folds for your Valentino Rose. You may decide that you want a little more than that, so if you want to add some extra petals, you can obviously cut some extras at the end. If you want to place your petal guide onto the fabric like so, you can see my bottom fold is coming up over the top there, so all of the petals should be therefore equal sized. Take your pins and pin through all the layers of fabric. A little bit like so. Make sure your pins are staying within the paper area, so that when it comes to cutting out your petals, then your pins aren't going to get in the way of your scissors as you go around. Oh, like mine is going to there. There we go. Could probably have done with some slightly shorter pins for this task, I think. These ones are a little bit long, but never mind. So there you go. Then if you take your scissors and just start cutting out your petals, as you can see, all of the layers are evenly caught. This is a reasonably rough guide, to be perfectly honest. My chiffon is quite slippy, so they're probably not going to be that like super evenly shaped, but that is not a disaster. Flowers are natural things, they aren't necessarily going to be perfectly symmetrical, so I'm not going to worry about that too much. I'm just going to keep cutting till I've got a nice stack of petals. Put all that to one side, like so. Then we can take the guide off. Ta-da! And these are our petals. How many have I got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Perfect. So next we need to turn your stack of fabric cutouts into the petals that will actually form your Valentino rose, like this little one here. So they look like this when they are finished, and they quite simply are these guys folded in half with a running stitch around the long curved edge. So what I mean by that is thread up your needle, tie a little knot in at the end, single thread, and pop that to one side so you're ready for it in a minute. Take one of your fabric pieces here and fold it in half long ways. It doesn't matter too much if your curves don't match each other perfectly. This whole raw edge is going to become the underside of the flower. So I don't know if you can see here, there aren't any raw edges anywhere. That's all on the inside and underneath of the rose itself, so you don't have to worry too much about any fraying bits. Take your needle and your piece of fabric here, with it folded in half, and starting in one corner, you just want to make a running stitch the whole way around. So anchor your thread first of all with the knot and a little extra stitch just to get you started, and then working a couple of millimeters in from the edge of the fabric, start to dip through the fabric to pick up the underside and come back up again, just a little bit like so. Very gently pull it through and ease it back out. You don't want any excess pulling at this point in your running stitch. If you're not comfortable performing it that way, you can go through and down and come back up again. Down through the fabric, pull it through and come back up again. Down and back up. Your running stitch should be a couple of millimeters in from the edge of the fabric. You don't want your fabric to fray and your stitches to fall out. If you're working on quite an unstable fabric like I am, then you will need to be a little bit generous with your distance from the edge. If you're working with something a little bit more stable like an organza, for example, then you can probably go a little bit closer to the edge. You don't want to come too far down into the body because this is the body of our petal here, so the further down into the body of the petal your stitching goes, the more shallow your petals will be in the end. So work your whole petal round to the end. Ease out any tension, and then when you get to the end, you're just going to do a little knot just to hold it all together. Nothing fancy, just like a double slip knot will do absolutely fine for this. And then you can cut off the excess. Be sure not to cut your knot off though, we do need that. There we go. That's one. We can pop it to one side and carry on making the rest. Right, so starting to form your rose itself. You've got your hoop all ready to go with, I've already got my existing rose on here, which you can use as a reference as I go along with the stitching. I'm going to be working right in the centre of my frame. Obviously if you were making more than one, you could put several all in the same frame and cut them all out afterwards. So don't be limited to doing just one at a time. To start making a rose, what we first need to do is to work on creating a really pretty little centre. Now to do this, what we're going to do is to take one of our regular petals, and you need to roll it along the stitched edge. Now this edge is always going to be the edge that we hide with the making of the rose, so that this lovely rolled, curved, closed edge becomes the outside of our petals each time. From the corner of the petal itself, you're going to start to roll that inwards, using that long edge as what's going to become the bottom of the centre. So keep rolling, rolling, right round to the end, and close that over as well. You should be left with something that looks a little bit like that. Once you've got that, you pop a couple of stitches into your fabric, just so that you're nice and securely anchored, and then come up and start stitching through that bud that you've just created, coming up inside of the lightweight fabric that you're using and coming back down outside of the center of the rose. Make sure with your other hand you're really hanging on to that bud that you've just created and being nice and secure with it. You don't want it unraveling whilst you're working on it. At this stage you are literally just looking to get it secured and down on the fabric. So don't worry about being too perfect. All of these stitches are going to be very much hidden in the middle of all of this. They're right down in there. So just get it secured at this stage. You can see I'm being reasonably large with my stitches. I'm not being all that careful. I'm sure you can do a much better job. Okay, so I've gone the whole way around. Don't know whether you can see my stitches in underneath there. My centre here is quite high, so what I'm going to do is to come up with my needle right through the middle of the rose, in the absolutely in the centre of the fold, and I'm going to go straight back down where I came from. And I've probably caught a little bit of the fabric there as I've come up, which is just going to encourage that centre down a little bit. A little bit like so. So we've got a nice twist going on and it looks quite bud-like and rosy. Just give it a little wiggle until you're happy with everything. Now don't pull that too tight, because you're just starting to create the tension that you want to maintain throughout the creation of your rose. So I'm going to put a couple of anchoring stitches just into my base fabric here to hold everything as I want it. Now we can start adding the other petals. Now this approach to the petals you're going to do for all of them. You're going to keep doing this, going around and around and around until we get to the outside edge of your rose, when you are happy with as large as it is going to become. And again, it's very similar approach to the bud itself. So this long edge is going to be the edge that we hide each time we stitch, and we're just going to keep going round and round from that. Where you begin is completely up to you. It doesn't really matter. There's not a wrong or a right side to this. I would just say that as you stitch, think about where you want your stitches to be and where you want the next petal to be placed. I'll come back to that in a moment. So I'm going to start mine just where the downward curve of the bud starts to go towards the base fabric. I'm going to go back a bit along the curve for where my first petal is going to begin. I'm going to come up through the base fabric And using my running stitch line on the base petal itself, I'm gonna stitch on the inside of that. So if you can see here, the running stitch is to the left of my needle, which is going to become the inside of the flower, so that all of my running stitches, which are a bit ugly and my fabric's a little bit fray there, all of that's going to get hidden inside, because it'll all be on the inside of the flower from where my needle is. And what you're going to do is just create some little pin tuck stitches to hold everything in place. Now by pin tuck I mean you're going to come up through the base fabric, pull the thread the whole way through like this, and then go back down pretty much in the same place. You're only going to be catching a few of the weave threads at a time off the fabric, but that's going to be enough to hold everything in place. Then as we move on, I'm going to come up through my fabric again. I'm still just on the inside of my running stitch, so that's going to disappear, and each time I'm just manipulating the petal around, so we're working with that curve of the running stitch and forcing it in to the rose shape. So we come up, pull it through, go back down through the same place, pull the petal round a little bit further, come up through the fabric, back down through the same place, working our way around, pulling that petal into the position that I want it to be, come up through the fabrics, pull it through, back down through the same place, each time hiding that running stitch. Move the petal, curve it round, bring the needle up and through everything, and catching it back down again. So you can start to see this upward curve of this first petal coming round. You want your stitches to be reasonably tight to your bud at this stage. The centre of the flower is going to be the tightest part. I mean this in relation to the sort of concentric circles of each of the petals and the stitch line that we're going to create with those. As you work outwards, you can get a little bit wider and wider as the flower folds outwards. You can probably see now why I wasn't that fussed about how good my running stitch was, as it's all disappearing. You can see all of that is all tucked in now. Come up and back down through the same place, keeping that raw edge tucked right in. How are you doing with that? So come up, pull through and come back down. When you start to get towards the end of your thread, just finish it off and start a new thread. Don't try and work with it too short, it's not worth the hassle. And I'm sure you've got plenty of thread to work with. Equally, when you get a new thread, I'd probably say we're working in quite a small area, don't worry about it trying to make it too long. Work with a length that you're comfortable with. You're better to refresh a new thread more frequently and be in control of that thread than have it knotting up all the time. Tie another little knot again, go up from the back, a couple of anchoring stitches and then carry on. So that is me anchored. pulling that petal into the place that I want it, coming up through all the layers and going back down. With that running stitch now, I think you can probably see that it's not really doing anything but holding the petal in the folded position that we want it. That's its only purpose. As you get to this point where you're going back into the downward slope of the running stitch petal, you'll probably need to apply a bit more pressure when you're pulling your petal round to force it into place, because this is a short edge and it's a curve. So I'd say start to come up through your base fabric and then pop the fabric on where you want it, pull it through, and you'll see it pulls it round into place, and then go back and catch it all down again, go back down through the fabric. So come up, catch the fabric and pull it back down. Just going to tidy some loose threads up a little bit here before I move on. And this will probably be the last stitch of this petal. Okay, so that's our first one down. Next one, we're going to do exactly the same. I'm going to start to think about how I want the petals to cross over. So this one is coming down and round to here. I'm probably going to go back along the curve of my rose a little bit, so that I've got a nice crossover of this petal coming down and the next one coming up. Starting off again, I'm going to come up to the right side, I'm going to catch the petal down with my raw edge on the inside of my stitching. As we're coming into what is, well, the second petal that's not the bud, so it's the third petal I have applied, I'm going to start to make the concentric circles a little bit wider, just so I start to get a bit more fullness into the rose itself. These are very subtle little changes as we go along, and I think the more you do, the more you'll see how that sort of comes together. Each of your stitches, of the pin tuck stitches that is, should probably be maybe 4 or 5 millimeters away from the last one. So these are very small stitches, but not that close to each other. Hopefully you can see that in my stitches here. So we've got like one here, one here, one here, one here. As you get more comfortable with forming the pin tucks, do think about controlling your thread as it pulls through the fabric, like so. This can really help with making sure that your thread doesn't knot as it pulls through the fabric, because it's not whipping around wildly as you're stitching with it. You've got control of it and you're easing it through the fabric, so it doesn't have a chance to kind of pull against itself and form any knots. Can be a little tip, not exclusive to roses, that can be really useful for all different types of stitching, particularly if you've got a tricky thread. That's really something to think about. And it will come more and more naturally with practice, like everything with embroidery. It's just really about practice and good preparation, as I mentioned earlier. So you can see this last circle is a lot bigger circle than the one of the previous petal, because the previous petal made almost 2 turns from where it began. So it began on this side and went round and finished here. But this one has started a little bit back from that and will finish probably about here. So only just over 1 turn of the bud. Now this is where you need to start thinking about how you want the petals to sit in relation to each other. So where do you want the next one to begin after this one? Because that one will be shorter still. And you can see in my finished example here, by the end, you know, your petals only go from one side of the rose to the other. They're not making a full turn of the bud. And ideally you don't really want to end up with all of the downward folds of the petals all forming in the same place, because that's the bit that makes it look more petal-like. So at the moment quite a lot of my crossovers are on this side, so I maybe want to start thinking about bringing that round to a different edge of the petal. This is where, if you've got a little malure, can come in handy. You can do this with a pin if you don't have a malure. If you've got any loose edges that are just poking out slightly, something like a malure with a nice pointy end, but that's not too catchy, like a needle can be sometimes, is really good for just smoothing that in. Probably going to make this my last stitch of this petal. Now that all looks controlled. And so, unsurprisingly, we are moving on to the next petal. Now, where do I want this one to start? You know, have a little play, have a little look. See what you're thinking. Because if this one starts over this side, then we're going to end up with the crossover still on this bottom edge here, which I think is where they all are. So I'm thinking that maybe this one should start perhaps over this side, so that the crossover is over here this time. Might look a little bit more natural. I think I'm going to go with that. When it comes to where the crossovers are though, there is no right or wrong. Don't get too het up with that. Roses, like all flowers, are natural things. They're always going to have little idiosyncrasies to them. And they're not going to all be exactly the same. If you're planning on making multiples, you know, don't expect them to all look exactly uniform. That's sort of part of the beauty of these. They are all going to be slightly different. Part of how you know they are handmade, made with love, care and attention, as I'm sure you will all be applying to your roses. With the controlling of the thread as it goes through the fabric, as my thread, you'll see now, is starting to get a little bit on the shorter side, it becomes a bit harder to do that. There's not as much to play with. So I will be thinking about getting a new thread, refreshing that shortly. Still exactly the same process of pulling the petal round coming up and going back down through the fabric in pretty much the same place, tucking all those raw edges in. And see, this petal is shorter still than the last because it only just makes a full turn, but only just. This will probably be the last one that makes a full turn. I don't know if you can see just here, there's a little bit of raw edge escaping, so I'm going to use my malord just to tuck all that in as I go. One final stitch for this petal. So I have myself a fresh piece of thread. As always, I'm going to start by drawing a little knot in it and putting some anchoring stitches into the base fabric, as I've done every other time I've threaded up before. So I'm thinking that my centre is looking a little bit too proud. It's sitting quite high in comparison to my other petals. So I'm going to go back up through the centre and go back down, straight down pretty much. And very gently I'm just going to pull that down a little bit, pull it into the centre. You see how that comes down into the body of the other petals a little bit more, and it looks quite a bit more natural there. Yeah, I think that looks a lot better. Okay, on to my next petal on the outside. Again, starting to think about where I want to put it, how it's going to cross over, where it's going to finish. This is just a very rough look. Maybe I'll bring that one further back. Yeah, maybe a little bit like so. That's what I'm thinking. So starting this one about here. How many petals you actually use at the end, again, is entirely up to you. I've got 8 in this flower here, or I will have 8, I should say, and I have made 8 with you today, as the fabric piece that we have has allowed us to cut. But you know, if you wanted to make a bigger rose, just add more petals. Alternatively, you know, think about scaling it up, providing the proportions of your fabric and the relationship to the draft are the same each time. You can scale this up as big or as small as you like. At the London Embroidery School, we like to teach you technique so that you can take this where you want to take it. You know, it's skills that you can apply however you wish, really. And once you've learnt the basics and you know the rules, you can break them, you know. So think about, you know, not only changing the colour of the fabric, that one's easy because you yourself are doing the same thing, but scale it up, scale it down, change the fabric, try it in different fabrics, see how they sit differently. These ones in the chiffon are obviously really soft to touch, which is lovely, and then being silk is also quite lovely because, you know, who doesn't like silk, right? but they are a little bit more slippy to work with, so you might find that something a little bit more stable is that bit easier to get started with in particular. With our classes, we also give you a piece of tulle fabric that's the right size for a Valentino rose to try as well. So you start with the organza in the class, and then providing you get on well with that, then towards the end of the class you move on to making a tulle version. It's silk tulle, so it is quite slippy, but they do make really romantic looking roses that are quite traditional to the Valentino style, which obviously gives these roses their name. They're usually in black, those ones. So today I'm breaking the rules of what we usually do by doing them in red. And we love to see what you have done with the skills that you learn from things like this. So, what did you put your roses on? Did you scale them up? How did they look when they were bigger? How small could you make them? How fiddly can they become? How dexterous are you? Impress us, Got a little bit of raw fabric popping out on this side, so I'm just going to tuck that right in. In you go, goodbye. There we go. And see, this petal has not made a full turn this time because the concentric circles are getting bigger each time the further away from the bud we get. Tuck that in. You go. As the rose starts to open out here, your chances of seeing the raw edge at the ends becomes greater because the circles are wider. So when you're getting towards the ends, don't be afraid to go back in and use your needle to kind of slide the raw edge in and grab it down. Tuck it in a bit further. Think about actually like making a loop around the raw edge and tucking and pulling it in, a little bit like so. Let's do that again over here. So come up, sort of tuck it in and down, pull it in. So obviously we want to get the best finish that we can with these. And there we go, that tucks that all away. Time for the next one. So I think again for balance I'm going to bring it back past where we finished the last petal, so that this one just balances this side and keeps the rose quite round. You want to be careful that you're not making your rose too one-sided. There's not too much weight on one side of the rose versus one of the other sides, and it becomes a bit sort of rugby ball shaped. Whilst I'm here, I'm going to tuck that raw edge straight away because I know that's going to be a problem now for these outer petals as we're into the second half of our rose. Let's get that all controlled. Push the edge in. I'm still catching just above that running stitch. So slide the petal in, manipulate the curve of the petal, the curve of the running stitch. just got to keep going till the end, the same way. We'd also love to see if you have tried your rose and maybe have managed to apply this technique approach of flower making to another type of flower. That's another way that you could take the skills that you're learning from this and push them forwards, make them your own. Don't be afraid to share this stuff with us on social media, or if you're not on social media and you'd like to perhaps email us instead. We just love to see, you know? We want to see what you guys are up to, what you're making. Because collectively we have so many ideas. And we're obviously trying to bring some to you. But we are limited to being quite a small team. You know, if we put a bit more of a collective together, imagine how many ideas there are between us all. Each month we run a Student of the Month competition on Instagram. So if you have taken a class or made something with some of our products, or used a technique that you've learnt from us in your own works, it doesn't have to be directly from one of our classes. If you want to share that with us on Instagram, tag us in it, then once a month we pick someone as our winner and they receive a 10% off voucher for anything on our website. It can be used against classes or materials or equipment. So yeah, you could, in theory, for some of our more expensive longer term classes, you could make a real saving with your Student of the Month voucher. Either way, every little helps, and anything that keeps us all stitching, it's got to be a good thing. Next petal going on. So I'm thinking going back a little bit again, and then coming forwards. Still looks quite round, doesn't it? Yeah, let's go with that. So I've come back a couple of centimetres from the finish of my last petal. Let's get this loose end under control. Another good use of the malure, it's able to sort of very tightly hold things that your fingers may just be a little bit too big for. The sorts of things that are quite good if you've got if you have your long nails. But if you don't have long nails, then a malure can work great instead. And equally, sometimes the finger that's attached to that nail is just too big. Don't know whether you guys have ever found that. Probably not something I thought I'd be saying today. This thread is getting a little bit short, a bit uncomfortable. Let's change that. So have you started to have some ideas about how you might like to use your roses once you have got really comfortable with making them and mastering them? Previously we have made headbands covered in them. We've put them onto rings, onto brooches, onto pins, hair slides, shoe clips, just some of the ideas that we have already tried out. Not that you can't do those too, of course. But the uses of this are really, really versatile, and I think because they are so soft and relatively flat in comparison to some other silk flowers that you might have come across, or in fact other silk flowers that we teach, they lend themselves very well to garments. You know, they will not be too proud and not take over, but they're a really sort of delicate, romantic addition. See my petals just sort of flipping inwards there slightly. That's just with the curve of the weave of the fabric itself. You see this one really wants to turn in. Perhaps I didn't cut this one that straight. Not to worry though, we're going to work with it. Luckily curving the way in towards the flower, the way I'm wanting it to go anyway. So although it's a little bit more wily whilst I'm working with it, it is lending itself in the right direction. Must be my lucky day. So as I previously mentioned, we have the Pro Tips range of blogs on our website in the blogs section, or you can use the search bar to just pop Pro Tips in there and they will all come up. There's a lot of really helpful, we hope it's helpful, tips and tricks, things we use as embroiderers in the studio, make our lives a little bit easier. Sometimes it's about some of the equipment and materials that we stock, how we use them, what you might like to use them for. Other times it's about technique, so things like different ways of threading your needle, different ways of forming a knot, different types of knots. All things that we hope will be helpful to you on your stitching journey. How to stitch with two hands is another one. You will have noticed here that I do like to stitch with both hands. I leave my right hand underneath the frame and pull through to that hand, and then my left hand stays on top. I am right-handed, so my right hand as my dominant hand I put underneath, and then my left hand as my weaker hand I give the benefit of, well, my eyes. That is possible because I today am using a seat frame, and so both of my hands are free. They are available on our website should you wish to try one. If you want to stitch with both hands, it is pretty necessary to have either a seat frame or a clamp frame. Clamp frame works the same as the seat frame, but it has a little barrel clamp that you can attach to a table. instead of the seat plank at the bottom, which I am sitting on, which stabilizes the frame. The other alternative to that is using a slate frame. Slate frames are the big flat frames that you may see some embroiderers using for things like timbre. It's lovely if you're working on a bigger area, and it's really good for really good tension throughout your fabric whilst you're working on your embroidery. They balance between trestles usually, which obviously supports the weight of the frame, allowing you, like with this frame, to stitch with both hands, which isn't absolutely necessary for timbre, but as can be demonstrated here, is mighty useful for other techniques too. Yeah, it's all those sorts of things that we talk about on the Pro Tips blogs. We do announce them on social media when they go up, so do look out for those. We also pop them, the notices, on our mailing list mailouts when they go, so make sure you're signed up for that too, to be the first to know about those blogs and also any offers we might have on, classes coming up, timetables, etc., new classes. Okay, so coming into the final bit of this rose, that was my last petal going on there. This last end, we do need to really focus on making sure that all of the raw edges are tucked underneath that previous petal. So I'm going to use the malure here to push it really far in, tuck that one right in, unlike we have with any of the others, I would say, much more so. And then I'm going to come up just outside of where I've pushed that last petal and use the needle to secure that down, probably just about catching the body of the previous petal, so that the smooth edge of this petal comes down ever so slightly over the raw edge of the one that I'm finishing and covers everything over nice and tidy. Let's do that again on this side. Let's just push all this raw edge in. Come up just outside. Grab a little bit of this petal. Pull it down just outside, and you see how that just pulled that in and down, covered all the raw edge over. There we go, I think I am done. And there you have it, those are my Valentino roses. The one above is the one that I did as an example for you guys earlier, and then the one below is the one that I've been stitching with you in this video. If we flip them over, you can see what I mean about the outward spiraling circles that you make with your stitches as you work across. You can see how far is between each of my stitches as well, just as an idea, and how many starts and stops there were, how many new threads I started each time to stop my thread from getting too short and to keep it comfortable for working with. Once you're done with that and you want to apply your roses onto whatever it is that you've decided you want to apply them onto, leave yourself a little margin around the edge of the flower of your stitches, because you obviously don't want to cut any of your stitches themselves. You don't want to cut the fabric of the rose itself either, obviously, and you don't want to cut it too short that your base fabric frays. So a couple of millimeters will be enough for that. If you just go around and mark yourself a small guideline, just to be sure of where you're going to cut. This should give you just enough fabric that you can tuck that underneath itself when you apply it onto your desired item. Then if you take your fabric scissors, we can cut in towards the edge, like so. Everything looks nice and clean on that side. It's just using my fingers underneath to make sure the petals all stay out of the way, and following those little guidelines that I just created. Just gonna cut around. Like so. You're left with a little freestanding rose like this, and then when it comes to applying, you just tuck these edges underneath like so, working your way around, and then you can stitch that onto your item and just have the rose itself when you're done. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope your rose has gone well. If you've got any questions or you need any help, please do get in contact with us. You can email us, classes@embroidery.london, or contact us on social media if you'd prefer to get in touch with us that way. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, please do share your makes with us. We'd love to see them. We hope you've had a good time and enjoyed this, and hopefully maybe see you next time. All the best and keep stitching.